Testing audio, can you guys hear me? Testing audio. Okay, hello everybody. Now that I've got the tech issues out of the way, let's get going. Quick overview for anybody who is just joined and has not like read the post or anything I posted before. This is I'm going to be making a scientific illustration focusing on a species of mushroom, and we'll start from research and sketching, and I'll just keep on painting and keeping on going. And feel free to chat at any time, ask questions, and I'll just keep on walking through my processes, my thought process as I go. So starting with the sketch, I already have an idea for the general look I'm going for, so I'm not paying too much attention. I'm just gonna start with my rough sketch. So I just use the Lasso Tool for big shapes because it's easier than painting them out. So now I'm just going over my initial blocky monochrome sketch with the thin lines so that eventually I can turn off the one at the back and this is a more refined version of the sketch, which will then allow me to paint over it. For these mushrooms I have references off screen. I'm not painting them from memory, just to get their general shape and details down. I'm adjusting the placements on quite a few of these depending on what looks like a better composition than the initial one, and that's basically what this entire phase is just about, is going over your composition, refining it. Anything which you'll not get right in the first pass you just want to be fixing. In this part of the sketch, my main goal is just to capture the most vital information, and I just leave the rest out. So I'm focusing on the mushrooms, these rhizomorph-like structures, and in the back I'm just making vague lines to represent the background, which I can just paint in without needing a sketch. It's not worth spending the time refining a sketch for something in the background when I can just paint it in without needing a sketch. That's basically just for my own reference to keep in mind what I want for the background. Now I'm turning the opacity down for this sketch, and I'm going to do another pass over. And in this I've pulled up a few closer up references, and I'm going to refine the shape further down and make it more realistic and accurate and something that can pass for scientific illustration. Whereas previously I just had a general loose reference of the composition and nothing very specific to the mushrooms. So following my references, I can see that I've given all of them a bit of a more pointier shape than they do. So you see I'm mostly just smoothing out the shape here. I see in the references it is more even and less pointy or conical. It's more smooth and round and pretty gentle in the curves along the sides. So that is what I'm going to try and replicate. And then I'm also giving this one a longer stem, which I had in the initial sketch, and then I shortened it down the second. And now look at references, the longer stem suits it better, so I'm going to make it long again. And I'm just going to move it down to this part so I can use my previous sketch without having to redo the entire thing. And I'm just going to focus on getting a better shape this time around. And then I will turn the sketch of that's behind it off and just check to make sure I'm building the shape the way I like it without the previous one still beneath it, which would obscure my view of it properly. I don't normally have the most detailed of sketches, but sometimes it does pay off to have a better sketch before going into a painting, so you don't have to be guessing too many details, especially if you're going for accuracy. scientifically. I'm giving it a bit of a shape variance here as well compared to the initial sketch. Had all of them pretty much following the same shape, which is very boring and does not make for a good interesting composition. So I'm changing that up now. I mostly stay zoomed out during this phase. I do not want to zoom in or look closely at any of it. It's just more for overall shapes and composition, so I don't need to zoom in or get caught up in details. That's for the painting stage. For this one I'm going to change it a bit more extremely. I'm just going to make it tilt backward instead of forward, which will also help with adding a bit of a more interest in the composition. Because this is a difficult angle to sketch out, I'm just gonna do it in steps instead of trying to go all of it in the same go, because the perspective can get a bit difficult. Now when it gets too messy, I just erase it up and tidy it. When I notice that I've got a very disproportionately small cap, so I'm just gonna enlarge it a bit using the Lasso Tool and move it around. And then because this particular one is so messy, I'm just gonna go over it again and tidy it up, which I will not be doing for all of the others. But it helps to go over a few times when it's a challenging placement. And I'm just consulting my reference for all of the little details that would be different from other species that will help me tell what species I'm portraying here. I need to look up the little details because I cannot paint everything. So you will choose which are the details that are going to sell your piece, the specific piece the most. So I'm just looking up a reference of the gills, which will be visible on this one because it is bent the other way. So I need to make sure I get those in a way that is accurate and is not going to get mixed up with other species. And again, I'm not focusing too much on details at this point, so these are just like rough squiggly lines. They're more for reference so that I don't end up forgetting that I'm supposed to have gills over there. And this still looks awkward and does not really, the placement looks off, but I'm not gonna go over it again when I can, I think, fix it by erasing this portion and just bring it in closer. Just not leaning that far back. I'm just gonna let this get a bit messy. I'm not too concerned. If I was trying to do something like line art, I'd probably have neater lines, but since this is just more of a reference for the actual painting, I'm not too concerned about what shape, how neat the lines are. And I'm just grabbing the warp tool now and warping it a little bit, which can help make the perspective a little better. Yeah, and overall I'm just going to scale it down a touch because this one's supposed to be a bit further in the back. So I'm selling my depth mostly by varying the weight of my lines. Darker lines, thicker lines up front. And anything bigger as a whole as an object is more likely to be at the front. I can delete the previous one. Okay, and we've got one over here. So I'm looking for a reference when it's in its lower, in a more earlier phase of its growth for this one, which is meant to be smaller and not fully developed as a fruiting body yet. And I'm gonna fix the shape of the cap, which is very asymmetrical here and lopsided. And their caps are not very symmetrical as a whole, but you don't want it to be that lopsided, which feels disbalanced. And I'm shooting for a bit of a more rounder, less developed look with this one, so it hasn't yet achieved its growth to the full form. I'm just gonna thin that line out and adjust its shape here. At this point it is not overly, it's very circular, it's not conical in that sense. There you go. And the stem's okay. I'm just gonna allude to the texture that the stem follows here, which is these weird dot-like things. I suppose I could load up a reference or two in a way where they're visible on the screen, but maybe next time. I'm noticing the cap has also this weird bumpy sort of texture, so I could just allude to it in the sketch as a reminder to make sure I bring that into the painting stage. But because I will be consulting references during the painting stage, that's not that big of a concern. This one has two wonky stem, so we'll make it less so, even out that a bit. And I'm going to give it a slight tilt to the back, but very slight. So just to get the reference, the angle, I'm gonna paint both sides, sketch both sides of the ring in, and then I'll put the cap, and it's slightly more like that way. That looks better. And then I'm just gonna point out where the gills should be with these squiggles, but I'm not too concerned about how accurate those are. At this stage I'm keeping each of these sketched on a different layer so I can move the composition around and adjust it as I need to, but it would work just as well if you put them on the same layer. It would maybe be a little less easy to move things around and adjust your composition later on, but nothing that would severely hinder you in any way. Just gonna save this, and we can write Armillaria. Okay, I'm going over that again because I was not too happy with how that turned out. I'm reducing the size of my brush here so I can get a thinner stroke and signify that it's further away from the ones closer. So the shapes of these are probably a bit more exaggerated than you'd get in reality, but you can always have a little bit of freedom of interpretation and get something that's more interesting to look at, even if it's not very true to real life. The goal with scientific illustration is to have a good balance between true to real life and having a little bit of artistic freedom to get a picture that looks good and is interesting to look at. So the only goal is not to have a scientifically accurate, it's also that it should look good. And if for that you have to push the shapes in some ways, make them a little more exaggerated, then it's not that big of a deal. This one has a bit of a confusing look going on to it, so I'm just making some marks to make it easier for me to remember what the angles are like. I'm gonna zoom in for a sec and give it a bit of a more exaggerated curve up here. Which is just to change the shapes up a bit, make it a bit more interesting. And yeah, I have not sketched in the main tree trunk, these are all growing on. And another main feature that I wish to feature, another main trait of these mushrooms that I wish to capture, is these root-like structures that are not normally found in mushrooms. They're called rhizomorphs, and they're one of the specialties of the species. So when I'm making a illustration about them, I pick the traits that I think are notable about this species that would set them apart from others, and then I'm gonna make sure I capture those. So for these, it is the rhizomorphs that allow them to spread even over miles and miles underground through the forest, and they're all connected. These are all like a single organism's rhizomorphs, and that allows the species to even be, there's one specimen which spreads over kilometers of ground, and it's one species, one single organism because these rhizomorphs are all belonging to the same organism, and it pops up the mushroom fruiting bodies at different locations, and that allows it to spread over a huge amount of ground. And I think that's a pretty key feature to the species, and so I'm going to make sure that I have it captured, and I'm gonna illustrate it, and therefore I'm putting the sketch as well. It's not one of those things like the background where I want the sketch to just have a reference for my own purposes. Okay, my actual sketch, the refined one, still lacks the log and the background. So I'm just going to choose a darker, thicker stroke for the log and show that it is a solid thing that's ahead of all of these, except this very front mushroom which is growing on the log. For my own reference, making sure I paint it with like a logish texture, I'm just gonna give these squiggles, make it seem round, helps give a bit of depth as well. I'm showing that there's some physical space they're all on, they're not just floating midair. This is not a very necessary part because this will all be covered in painting when I'm gonna make sure I get all of these little things right, but I find it's useful to sketch them out as well. And how refined you make the sketch is totally up to you. Lots of people have much more refined sketches than I do. I do not refine my sketch a lot. I just want it to be enough clear that I can paint off of it without being confused as to what my initial intention was. And most of my sketches are very rough because I'm just toying with ideas, playing with them, changing them. And I had a pretty general idea of what I was shooting for with this piece, and therefore I have not messed with the sketch as much as I normally would. I would be normally spending a lot more time just fiddling, doing quick thumbnails in black and white, figuring out a general composition that works, and that kind of stuff is just, I had it pretty much figured out for this piece. And sometimes pieces require a bit of a more experimental sketch, I suppose, than what I gave this. But it's just, it depends with each piece. That tree in the background is incredibly huge, so I'll shrink it down some in the line. And I'm not too concerned about how straight and even these lines are. I just want to mark it down that, yeah, there's stuff in the background there. Making sure not to cut the line across in front of the mushrooms. That stuff's in the back, and I want it to remain there. When I'm choosing a background, in this case it is mostly to give scale. Having huge trees in the background will show how small the mushrooms really are, and it's also giving an idea into their habitat. These mushrooms mostly grow in forests and through the trees. They spread the rhizomorphs through and underneath the bark, and that's why this is fallen tree, and it will have the rhizomorphs underneath it. So it's mostly, I'm picking the background for this one off of that basis. But if it's not anything in particular, you could just have a background that sets it off nicely in a visual way without having any, I wouldn't say purpose. Your background must serve a purpose, but it does not need to be very relevant. And now I'm putting the entire sketch together, and I'm actually just gonna rotate it. And this is now, I'm just experimenting. I'm not sure if this will look nice in any way, but it's worth a shot. I feel like it should be, yeah, I kind of like that. But not tilting the mushrooms so much. I seem to have an empty layer. So I'm using the Lasso Tool and just selecting the caps of the mushrooms and then using the Warp Tool to shift them slightly more upward. And if I show a before and after, it's not actually making much of a difference, so I think I'll actually do this instead. Is just warp the entire thing upward a bit. Basically all I'm trying to show is that they're angling themselves upward toward the light. It gives a sense of direction. I want the log to be tilted, and having all of them facing the same direction is a bit off-putting to that sense. Before I do that though, I need to fix the fact that these mushrooms have no indication of direction here. So I'm just giving them these small lines that indicate their curvature and form a bit better than empty lines. This is once again all stuff that will be taken care of in the painting and is more just for my own reference in balancing a composition that having that form will help. Just going individually to their layers and adding this. It really helps sell the fact that these are round, they're curving, they're bending, they're not just empty blobs. They have depth and volume. And the other three have got the gills to cover the texture pretty nicely. So I'm just gonna add some to this one, which can do with a little sense of direction. But having the gills on this one and this one helps because we can tell their general direction from the fact that we can see their gills, which should be on their base. And now I'm just gonna select a few of them can do with a bit of a direction change. So I'm using Lasso Tool, and this time I'm just rotating. And I'm gonna bring it to a place which I think will work out fine. And then I'm just gonna redo the stem real quick, which will even out that bit of edge it leaves from the rotation. And overall this is okay. I think it's selling the composition I wanted okay. I will just adjust the scale. I think these ones can do with being a little bigger, as they're supposed to be closer. So I'm just scaling them up, and I want to do all of these changes before we reach the painting stage, because scaling objects up and down will ruin your quality. So you want to make sure get all of them out of the way in the low quality sketch phase, instead of spending your hours doing high detailed work and then having to rotate or transform and ruin your quality in some way. And I think this is at a stage where I can start, I can take it to the painting now. The painting level, I just wanna think of a color scheme, of which I have not thought of one. I had a composition in mind, but I really did not have much of colors in mind. But before we do that, we can get our sketch out of the way. So I'm gonna select all of these layers. They're in a group already. Okay, cool. At this point I normally would delete the two previous sketches I have, but I think I'll just leave them in here for now in case I need to come back to them. So we'll just pop them up out of the way above the sketch even, and I'm gonna throw in a new background, a new layer above the background, and we can start thinking about what colors I'm looking for. So we'll get to picking colors in a minute. Okay, so I went over this with a brush with color jitter on it, and that is a quick way to introduce this texture that you see here. So I did Alt backspace and filled it with solid color, and then went over it with a brush with color jitter. It's a quick way to introduce texture and keeps it from looking flat and digital. And I'm keeping my colors desaturated so I do not end up oversaturating them when I get round to the final lighting stage. And so starting with desaturated colors is much easier than ending up with horrible colors later on once you do the lighting and having to redo them, bring them down or adjust them later. So for all my major shapes, I like to start with the Lasso Tool, which is easier. It just gives you a quick selection. And as you can see here, I'm going past even what my sketch has, because I rotated my sketch afterwards, and that's gonna throw off the lines a little bit, but they're enough that I can compensate for them while selecting, and I'm not too worried about that. So I'm just keeping quick, smooth movements so I don't end up with shaky selections, and I'll undo those last two. They're not very necessary. When picking colors, I have a reference board up for the general color of the bark of the trees that they occupy, and then I'm thinking about the kind of lighting that I want them to be in, and I am choosing based off of that. And this log is very much in the foreground, so I'm going to choose a dark color for it, a dark woodish color, so something around that, except we can desaturate it a bit. And I'm on a new layer from the background and using the same. I'm going to turn the jitter down a bit. I had it very high for the background, but when I'm blocking in the object, I do not need such a high color jitter. That is very light. Can choose something darker. Let's just do Alt backspace, and I'm choosing a darker color and going over it with the jitter brush. And that gives it, you can see there's plenty of texture here already, without a lot of effort. To give it a more realistic sense of depth, I'm choosing something a little lighter for the parts that are going to be further away from us, and darker colors close, because that is how the values tend to work. Darker colors, more saturated colors, mean stuff is closer to us. When things get further away, they look lighter, they fade into the background colors a little more. So as far as the log is concerned, you will not be seeing any such major shift in colors in such a small distance, but it helps to have a bit of color variance in your object. You don't want everything to be on the same color. And now see I'm going with a smaller brush already, and I'm just gonna fill in these faint round movements that are following the lines I made in my sketch. I'm just gonna give it a bit of the shape that I'm looking for, and I'm going back and forth between the darker color that I have up front and the lighter one that I'm shooting for behind, and just giving it a bit of a more noticeable shape. And this counts as a bit too much effort I'm giving for the initial block-in stage, but I find it helps a little bit later on. But you could always do this later when we're adding in the details. It's not like a necessary part. And then I'm choosing the darkest shade, and I'm just filling in this bottom right corner, which is supposed to be the closest. And now I'm going to deselect. So I only use the Lasso Tool for major shapes. Anything more in the background, and I'm not going to use the Lasso Tool, because the Lasso Tool tends to create hard edges, and that is good for stuff that you want to have close to you, but for anything in the distance it looks unrealistic very fast. These trees are meant to be quite in the distance, so I'm just going to color pick a darkish green from the background, darken it slightly more, and shift it towards a slightly more orangish color, and that should do for my trees in the back. Because I do not need to give them much detail, they're just supposed to be distant figures giving the scenery context. We're in a forest here, or what looks like a forest. There are trees around us, and it's also telling me that this type of mushroom is growing in a forest environment. I'm not using Lasso Tool here, it's just using directly the brush. This brush is not very good for painting directly on because it has a very textured edge, and if I zoom in you'll notice that it is not staying within the lines at all. So I'll just switch to a brush that is easier to work with. I like using brushes with texture. This is a oil textured brush that I'm switching to now, and I much prefer using brushes with texture because they look and feel more real. But you can use any brush of your choice, it does not really matter. So I'm just gonna redo that using a slightly less brownish color because that looks very horrible. The tree is meant to be quite far in the back, so I'm just picking a slightly darker shade than the initial greenish background I have, because the further away things are, the more you can expect them to fade into the background. Just going to turn the opacity of my sketch down a little bit. And I just realized I painted my tree onto the same layer as the background, so let's just undo that. This tree is quite small compared even to the mushrooms in front, which appear much bigger than it, but I'm hoping to imply scale by showing it as very light in color. It is just a barely there green shadow against the background, and that should hopefully not make the scale very confusing. It's just further away, not so it's smaller. As you can see, I'm quite zoomed out. I do not want to get caught up in the details and making sure everything looks pretty at this stage. This is just rough color. You can even use the selection tool for the background ones if you want, and just get that color down. It's not meant to look nice at this stage. That comes later. I'm not gonna put all of my trees on different layers, but I have like staggered depths here, so all of these trees are basically the same distance apart from us as like the camera or the viewer, so they can be on the same layer. I prefer to keep things generally very layered out. It makes easy adjustments. I can change the colors at one click if I need to, and it makes keeping track of things easier. But you don't always need multiple layers, and like now I'm not gonna make new layers for each of these background trees. I just need a general background tree layer. Which reminds me, I probably should name the layers, but... So turning my sketch off just to check what it looks like, and I noticed that there's a point here, which is quite shaky. Once again, these are so far in the background that I'm using just a brush and painting them in roughly. This will not look very finished to end even once I'm done with the entire thing. They should just look like distant trees. They don't need to be close or detailed or in any way look very... You don't want to make them the center of attention, and keeping things undetailed, rough is a good way to push them to the background and not draw attention to them. There's one more tree which is on the same plane. It's slightly closer, so I'm gonna make it slightly darker. A good way to check if your values are working out right. I'm just gonna erase some part of this before we check the values. I have my eraser set very hard, but that's not a problem. I can just redo those parts with a brush instead of choosing soft erasers. I don't like soft erasers, but I suppose I will choose one. So it's just a soft round. Size is set to pressure for the eraser, so I can manipulate the edges and then just paint back if I do too much. And if I turn the sketch on, yeah, I suppose this one can be a little lighter. It is too close, so I'm just gonna select it, Lasso Tool, and then using the levels adjustment by pressing Ctrl L, I can lighten it a bit. That looks better. So a good way to check if your values are working out right, if you've got closer stuff darker and the stuff further back lighter, is to go into View, click Proof Setup, and Custom. I click Working Gray, Dot Grain 20%, and OK, and it shows you a black and white version. As you can see, this is leaning pretty heavily. It is very limited in its toner range. Everything's very dark. There's no obvious light at all, and that's okay. You do not expect your values to work out perfectly at this stage, but as you do your lighting, this will come in handy to make sure you're not pushing your values too far. And the only reason I'd use it this early in is making sure I've got good colors that are not too dark or too bright, depending on on the depth I'm trying to capture. Now for the trees closer, I'm turning the color a bit warmer, such that it shows a little bit of the tree bark color through as they're closer. And also because they're huge, I'm just going to use a Lasso Tool. And I know I said this makes pretty rough edges, but I think at this point it would be worth it and just refine them later. I'm just going to smoothen out the shapes a bit. And on a new layer, because these are on a different plane, I'm just gonna go over the selected part. If I hide my selection, you can see how this one is a lot more clearly defined than the ones in the back, and that is the combination of the fact that I've got harder edges and the colors are darker. In fact, I'm starting to think the colors are too dark, but I will leave them be for now and maybe we can adjust them later. I actually don't want to deselect it right now. Just gonna sharpen out some of those edges. My brush is set such that the flow is 60%, meaning that it's not leaving a very solid line to begin with. I can demonstrate what I mean by that. If I drop in a solid black and then I will choose a solid white color, and using this brush, if I draw, you'll see that the initial line is more gray, and the more I paint over it, the brighter it becomes. And then it's also set to opacity pressure, so the lighter I press, the fainter the color will be, the harder I press, the sharper the color will be. And that is good for building up colors in a nice believable way. So when I did multiple passes over the tree trunk, you can see that some strips are darker, some are lighter, and that keeps it from being very perfectly digital or unrealistic. A little bit of the I guess organic shapes or whatever bleed through with the varied opacity. I'm selecting this tree next, and I'm diverting the shape from the sketch a little bit, because I feel like it's gonna work out better. Once again, I do not refine my sketch too much, so I often play around with it later on. And this is just like a personal choice. You could go as refined with your sketch as you want and then not divert from it a lot in the painting. So I'm just gonna color pick the one I had in the front, and I think I might choose a slightly lighter color for this one, which feels like it's more at the back. Yeah, I'm gonna lighten the color just a little bit, so it's not as close as the one on the left. And then I feel like I can drive that sense of scale a little more, so let's select the one in the front and make it a little bigger, scale it up a bit, and instead of make it lighter, let's make it darker. Or actually, I don't even think I need to make it darker. There you go. So that gives a good sense of scale. We've got this tree is the closest, that is the furthest away, and we've got one over here as well. Once again, I'm diverting from sketch a little bit because my shapes were not very clean in the sketch. Here we go. I'm not gonna change the color much. I think this one's okay. And we'll just fill it in. I'm doing these on the same layer. They're not exactly on the same plane, but I'm treating them as because they're in the background and I'm not spending too much time thinking about which layers they should be on. Gonna darken it just a touch and run a few darker strips over it. And then just choose a lighter one actually and just break up the pattern a bit. Okay, so now we've got the basic scene setup. We've got the log and the forest in the back and the trees, and we can get started on the mushrooms themselves now. So we'll take a 5-minute break and then we will come back to the mushrooms. Okay, we can get going on the mushrooms now. I pulled up a few more references on the mushrooms for their colors and details that we'll need when we start painting. So for the mushrooms, I'm going to start by lasso tooling the main shapes. And I have a feeling we'll be racking up quite the layer count here because I like keeping stem and cap on separate layers. And we have a decent amount of mushrooms, so we'll probably hit quite an impressive layer count. So using references is probably the most important part of getting scientific illustrations right, especially when it comes to colors and textures and such details that you cannot wing it and hope to get anywhere. You need to make sure you've got reliable references that you can check colors against, and you also need to know how to use said references and apply them to your own painting. You cannot expect to find a reference for every situation, and that's okay, but you need to know what colors in your reference will translate to what colors in your painting, and how your lighting, your scenery, everything will affect. So I'm looking at references. I see the stem is starting out this palish color, and then lower down it is fading to quite a pronounced brown. So I'm going to lower the opacity of my brush and bring this gradient in. But as you can see, I'm experimenting quite a bit because I cannot get the colors right in the first go, and that's okay, but I have a general idea of what the colors I'm looking for are now, because I'm checking my references, and I know which direction I need to be heading in. So after a few experiments, I will have got the flow down for which colors need to go where. And this is once again just a rough block-in. I'm not looking for this to match perfectly, but I need to have the colors in the correct places before I can further detail and render out the painting. So this is okay as a starting point. The lower part can probably go a bit darker. I'm keeping my brush's opacity set to 50% so that I can blend it a bit easier without having to go back and forth. At this point it looks muddy and not very nice, and that's okay, it is to be expected. At this point I will have to name layers because this will get messy fast. Okay, for the cap, I'm gonna select it out. I'm a little more forgiving with the selection for the stem than I am for the cap because the cap's up top, and having a stem that's slightly too big can easily get concealed in the cap, but you must be more careful when selecting the cap, which will have nothing to cover it. And you don't want to be shoddy about the selection here. So once again, I'm using references for the colors. I'm seeing what colors are closest to what I see in the reference and how they will work in the lighting and setting I have going here. So I'm seeing a slightly more reddish hue in the reference, but if I choose such a reddish hue, it looks out of place in my lighting scenario. So I must keep to a more desaturated, darker color. They're not in light at present, at least, so we're going to shoot for a darker neutral tone. As I did with the background, I will be starting the mushrooms out with neutral colors, because you don't want to up the saturation and have it such that were you to start actually giving this dramatic lighting, adding highlights and shadows, you end up with colors that are very over the top saturated. You want to choose colors that can take the extra embellishments of lighting without being oversaturated for it. And once again I'm shifting to 50% opacity and just blending in a thin lighter colored streak that I see in the mushrooms around here. So I'm just adding that in a little bit, giving the color variation from now. And how much detail you want to go with the block-in is up to you. At this stage I recommend not turning the sketch off, because everything will look so horrid that you will not, it will just not look very nice at all. And this is cap, and then I'm gonna group them together and we can just call it 1. I'm gonna name the groups in order of their appearance from right to left. Once again, as with the trees in the background, I might have to alter the sketch a little bit, as I noticed stuff which I missed in my refined sketch, which should be corrected. This stem is very wonky and not even at all, so we will correct that. So once again I'm overshooting a little bit. The stem is going into the cap, and I'm not too concerned about that because I have the cap above it to cover. So I'm more loose with my selecting the stem than the cap. Now that I have colors from the first one, I can color pick and adjust as needed. But don't forget to bring your brush's opacity to 50% for every, to 100% for every new selection you make. Okay, now switching to 50%, I'm going to introduce the white tones from the other one. My opacity is at 50%, so I can bring them in gradually and blend it out. You might have to zoom in a little bit at this phase, but I would avoid it as much as possible, because zooming in is the easiest way to get lost in bringing up details way too early. So I'm just blending it out. I see a faint like streakish texture going on in the references that I'm using. So I'm gonna try and emulate that by adding these like lines going up and down. It's not a perfect smooth gradient. There you go. Okay, then we can get stem, and now we select the cap, and I keep on zooming out by mistake. Okay, I have for some reason a very messy sketch of the cap over here, and this is probably something that you should avoid. Is I have to think and figure out what each of the lines are doing, and that is not the sign of a good clear sketch. So and just a point worth mentioning with as how clean you're willing to go with your sketch. Okay. There's a little point here where I've overshot it, as I'm not keen on having a messy cap selection. I'm gonna clean that up. Once again, messy on the stem is not as big of an issue as messy on the cap, because the stem has got the cap above it covering it. The cap doesn't. So you want to be careful about that. Bring brush opacity up, hide my selection, and bring for the cap. I'm going to turn my sketch's opacity a little lower. It's hard to see the colors properly. There you go. I think that's okay for now. So these colors are slightly different from what I'm seeing in my references, and that is okay, because I can always pay more attention when I'm rendering. And at this stage I'm using color jitter as well, which will be affecting the colors because it's changing, it's fluctuating the hue for the texture, and that's okay. The inaccuracy to the color is worth the trade-off for the texture, according to me, in my eyes, and I can always correct the colors later manually by adding texture, and I'm not much concerned about that. But having this base texture is, I think, a bigger deal to me personally than having super accurate colors. It's just a matter of personal preference. So going for the third one. It's a bit irritating when you accidentally let go of the lasso tool halfway. I'm just gonna clean that edge up a bit. So I'm willing to shoot extra in terms of height of the stem, but not lengthwise, because I don't have stuff covering it then. So I want the sides to be smooth and it shouldn't look awkward. As for the length, I don't mind extrapolating a little bit, because that will be taken care of by the stem. So choosing my whitish color again, and I'm starting to white this stem. We'll do the stem in. Hide selection so I can see the edges better, and then choosing the dark color, brush opacity 50%, and just gradient out the dark color. I think using references is the most important part of most painting of any sort you do, be it for getting the colors, textures, this, that, but it's even more important in scientific art, because you have to be very unforgiving of inaccuracies. You want it to be accurate as much as possible, and trying to blind guess it would not work. So this gradient that I'm working on here, I'm looking at the reference and I'm seeing how it's working out there, and I do not expect it to match, but I want the base colors to at least be the same. I think this part is a little bit too bright, so just gonna darken it a little bit. This seems like a good color. There you go. Control D, this is stem, and we'll add in a new layer for the cap. I zoom in when selecting the cap a little bit because it's easier to see the lines, but it's a payoff because the more you zoom in, the harder it is to trace the shape properly. So you just want to find the balance where you can trace the shape easily and not sacrifice on being able to see the lines at all. After all, you won't be able to trace it very accurately if you cannot see what you're tracing. I seem to have overshot it a little bit here, and I'm willing to keep a little bit of exaggeration above the sketch because that's just like a bit of a neat line work, but not too much. So I press Ctrl hide and just check my selection edges. Ctrl H to hide the selection borders and just make sure they're working out according to my sketch beneath. I'm aiming for the points to have a little bit, the edges of the cap to have a little bit of a point, as that is what I seem to be seeing in the reference, but I don't want to overdo it, so just be a bit careful here. Okay, we'll pick a good color. I'm copying the same color I had for the previous ones, and that's okay. I would advise against color picking from a picture, because that you're seeing the combination of all the lighting, details, texture, everything, and you will get the wrong color and it will not work out in your composition, in your original piece. And also you'll have the issue that you will never learn how to pick good colors. The most easier, if you have to color pick, then eyeball it, choose a color that you think will work, and then sample it against a picked color and see how close you are. But you will never be perfectly close even in color picking, because you're seeing a combination of the lighting, texture, everything combined, which you don't want to be putting down initially, because then when you I'm putting down. So even when you're initially putting on colors, you're sticking with colors that are desaturated, that do not have additional lighting effects, there's not been rendered yet. So you don't want to choose a color from an image which already has actual lighting, reflections from surroundings. All of these little things will be affecting the hues, and you end up with colors that do not match your picture. Anyway, yeah, so you shouldn't, I would not recommend doing color picking off of pictures, but as far as color picking off of your own colors from your painting, then there's nothing wrong with that, because you already chose the colors initially and they're working in your environment. You know that there's no additional lighting effects to it, so there's no need to be concerned about getting incorrect colors, inaccurate colors, or about not ever learning to pick correct colors by perpetually color picking from pictures. So you have to train your eye to see colors in a picture and deduce what colors you should be picking from your color wheel based off of that. I'm just adjusting the stem on this one, which felt odd. Once again, for the mushrooms, I am using the brush with color jitter, so there might be some inaccuracies in the color, but I don't mind, I can always correct them later. And we group them all. This is number 3. We can go to the 4th one. So this one's stem is bent, and judging by the references, this is something that happens, having them grow sideways in, I would assume, bad light conditions, but it is not very common, and so I'm going to try and find a blend where I can make the gradient work, despite it not being a very common position. And that is where you will need to learn how to apply references in different areas. So I have got references for the color pattern in a plant that is in a stem that is straight, but how am I supposed to apply that when the stem is all curvy and bent like this? And that is something I think that just comes with practice. I'm not very good at it, but I would assume practicing will get you to the stage where you can apply the colors from your references in different ways. Starting with the white again, because I already had that color picked, and then switching to the dark one and bringing it from the base. Now I could just leave it like this, and the reason I'm not going to do that is because it looks completely artificial. If you look on the others, I have got them going by the references. They're going higher up along the ridges of texture. You've got the brown color seeping higher, and leaving it just wonky like this does not work. So I'm going to switch my opacity to 50% and just blend it out, bring it up higher on the lines of texture, and blending the gradient a little more evenly. And then I'm just going to concentrate the darks in the lower part of the stem. I feel, judging by the references, that the longer side, this side, can be a little bit on the darker side, I feel, and I can have the white sort of be coming down this side. Yeah, I think that is a good payoff. It's blending nicely, and it will be following mostly realistic texturing. I can always improve this later, obviously, as I come into the rendering stage. I'm trying not to leave any of my edges too muddy. That just makes work harder. So you want to keep it even. Your color definitions must be careful. And this is stem. Let's make a new layer from the cap. Sometimes I go with the selection a few times because it's hard. I'm not good at making smooth selections, and smooth selections are incredibly necessary. So you see me control Zing and going over them several times until I can get smooth and also not overshoot or undershoot or selections are difficult, and this is a wonky shape as well. I think that will work. I'll just smooth this edge out a little bit, go a little rounder up there. So drawing faster shapes quicker helps keep it smooth, but I often lose the accuracy then. But somebody who's better at drawing lines could probably do that easier. I'm color picking the brown from the previous one. Brush opacity 100%, and we'll just fill it up quickly. And choose a slightly lighter color and just lower opacity 50%. Just add that lighter ring of color. At some point before we even reach the lighting stage, as soon as we hit the rendering stage, you'll have to plan out what direction the light is coming from in your piece, the quality of light, whether it's daylight or sunlight, artificial light. What kind of light you're having will completely affect your rendering. But before that stage, you mostly have to just keep in mind what color theme are you going for. If I was going for something painted more at night, for example, I choose cooler colors even for the mushrooms, which would be affected by the ambient bluish moonlight. Since I'm shooting more for something at day beneath like the dappled shade of trees, I'm choosing more warmer. The colors are almost towards green. If I were to make a new layer and fill it with white, you'd notice that the color I have been using for... That's not even a very white color. Let's just make the background white. There you go. And you see that the color I'm using for the cap is not as dark as it appears initially, and it's even slightly greenish. And that just goes to show that if we were to take the color from a local, if you were just to look at the color isolated, they'd appear a whole lot more different than when you look at them in your scene. So all that I'm trying to say is that you should make sure you know what kind of lighting you're going for before you put the colors down, because your colors will be affected by it. So I'm just going to keep on working through these. The process is the same every time. Lasso Tool, gradient out the colors, and Lasso Tool the cap, gradient out the colors. There isn't much changing in between until I get to a rendering process. Here is one instance where I cannot be forgiving with the stem in my selection, because there is no cap covering it here, because we're seeing the cap tilted away from us. So you have to be careful here. I'm gonna make sure I get a nice round edge to my stem selection, because that is how it would appear. And then just gonna color pick this stem color, and then just lighten it up slightly.
Just give me 1 minute. Just give me 1 last minute.
And then I'm color picking the dark shade from here as well, and bring it up the lower part of the stem. And here's a good way for me to really show the fact that the stem is curving. Although before I do that, I'm just gonna go on my selection tool and fix the fact that there's a gap. The stem is not coming all the way down. Yeah, I think here's a good opportunity for me to display that the stem is bending away from us. Is the black and white pattern, the brown and like lighter color pattern. I can really exaggerate the curve in there and let the brain know that I intend for this to be curving away from us, which can be difficult because there's no actual depth here. So I can just exaggerate the sideways curve and it will feel more like it's curving away from us. There you go. And then you can really darken out the base. So I'm going to choose a slightly darker color and just go over the very base again. There you go. So there's a little more color variation in that particular one, and that's just because I'm trying to focus on really selling the angle of the stem. Okay, we can... Okay, so for this one we're gonna have 3 components to the cap. To this one we have got the cap and the gills, which we need to select separately. And the gills are running on a different color as well from the cap. Yeah, you can't be very forgiving with the gills either because there's nothing covering them. But I think I managed a decent selection. I'm just gonna go pull up my reference for its gills again because I need to double check what color I'm shooting for. So apparently we're looking at fairly pale creamish gills. So probably something like this, but slightly darker. And here actually I'm going to push it to be quite a bit darker because it's beneath the cap. So we're not expecting it to be being hit with a lot of light. And here is why you would have to think about your lighting direction, pattern, everything from before. Now here I can pause and go over what I want from the lighting in this piece anyway. I want it to be coming from upward. Obviously we're very close to the ground. We're literally on a log on the ground from our point of view. So we need light that's coming from up. I think I'll have like a gradual drift of golden light just falling in through the... Yeah, I'm just gonna let it come straight up. From up directly, as if though it's from a canopy of leaves. So I can darken the gills a little more, I think, especially concentrating it around the portion by the stem, which I'm seeing in my references is dipping slightly inward, so that will help push the depth a little more. And then I can choose a lighter color and just bring it in around the edges and let it feel like there's a sort of curve arching outward over there. And then get the darker color on the very outside again, where it's gonna be in the shade of the cap's outer fringe, if that makes any sense. The part of the cap that like bends down over the gills will be shadowing it more. But as a whole, the gills will be in shade, so I'm just gonna darken them entirely a little more. That looks okay. And most of the lighting for the gills I can perfect in the rendering stage. You notice I have got the gills layer beneath the stem layer, and that allows me to not have to worry about selecting around the stem. If I were to turn the stem off, then I've got gills all the way through, but I just need to keep the stem on and the stem is above it. And now we can do the cap. Before I do the cap, I'm just gonna expand the gills a little bit. There seems to be a bit of a gap over here and here and here, and this is overshooting it a little bit, but since I will be painting over it with the stem, with the cap, I'm not much concerned about the overlap. There you go. If I turn the sketch off, you can see that I've got the edges selected nicely. Once again, I do not recommend turning the sketch off at this stage because everything looks very ugly. Okay, I can now go on selecting the cap. This is a difficult cap to select. The perspective is horrible, and the lines are kind of shaky. There you go. So I'm going over the part a little bit that the gills are occupying, and I'm not concerned about that, and I'll show you why in a second. If I go over it, just refining my selection real quick. Okay, and then since my cap layer is going to be above everything else, I want to make sure I'm not chopping off a section of it for no reason. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Ctrl Alt and then click on the gills, and now you see I have minused the gills from my selection. Now I'm just going to manually include some of the very fringes, which is where the edge of the cap is coming over the gills in reality, and which I want to have the cap over. So it's much easier to let the initial selection go over the gills and then just subtract the gills from your selection instead of trying to get everything perfect in the same go. And then switching to my dark color for the cap, which is a little too dark. Can choose that color instead. There you go. Now I can choose a slightly lighter color and put in the lighter highlight, and this will once again help sell the angle, is seeing how the lighter patch on this one is more distorted than in the other ones. This lighter patch is something I've been noticing in all of the references I have seen, and I've not seen it in any of the descriptions of the species. Does not mention any particular lighter strip along the middle, but I'm seeing in most of the references I've opened they have this sort of variegated pattern. So I'm going to include it because I feel like it helps distinctify the mushrooms a bit more. Okay, we can name this the cap. Group them together. And we've got 2 mushrooms left. And this is a bit of a time-consuming procedure, the sketching and blocking in phase. And it's also one of the most, I would say, off-putting parts about the process, because at this point everything looks very ugly, especially if you turn the sketch off and then you're faced with this and you're like, what are you supposed to do with it? But at this point it's easier to just turn a blind eye to how horrible everything looks and keep on going, and it eventually looks better. Let me go hunt up a reference of a mushroom in this younger phase of growth. Yeah, so I'm seeing the colors are more brown and less white at this stage, which is interesting. I thought there might be more white and less brown. And also the stalk is pretty thick and even throughout. There's not much of a change in its width because it's still growing out. So I'm gonna choose this color from the stem, and yeah, I think the color can stand to be a little darker. Okay, and then we switch to the light color, and I'm just gonna drop opacity of my brush to 50% and bleed it in just softly around the visible edges. There isn't a whole lot of white, and what there is very softly blended and textured into the stem, so I'm just gonna shoot for that look. I'm using a smaller brush and just working it into the light color. So I'm mindful of what is actually visible beyond the cap. My initial stem, the original stem, is going much higher because I overshot it, but I'm just gonna blend the colors mostly in the region that is visible, because putting effort into something that I know will be invisible for the entire piece is not very much a good idea. We can do the cap. The cap is also more reddish and less dark in the younger ones I'm seeing, and the light strip is, I think it's a little more pronounced. It's more concentrated, I suppose. Just gonna round those edges out a little bit. Here you go. So I will color pick from this one. They're not that different that I can't, but I'll just shift the colors slightly into a more reddish zone, and then we can see how that works out. Because I am noticing that the younger ones tend to have a more reddish hue, but it's not very major, so I'm just gonna zoom out so I can look at the colors better. And then I'm gonna choose this slightly brighter color for the strip, and we can concentrate it along the very top. There you go. There you go. I'm just gonna, yeah, that looks okay. It's something I can work with in the rendering phase. So in this stage, I just want to put good colors down. And speaking of good colors, I'm gonna select the stem and improve that color a little bit. Something a little darker. And just on low opacity, work it into the stem a little bit. Looks a bit better. It's a bit too green, I don't know why. I suppose the background is seeping in from the colors I'm picking, and that is a downside of picking colors from your own work, is any faint opacity changes will affect the color that you pick, and the result will not be the same every time you pick. And that just goes to show how finicky picking colors can be, where even when you're picking from within the same Photoshop document, there is a discrepancy, let alone picking from photos or anything. Okay, we only have one mushroom left for flat colors. Yeah, sometimes you can tell from the start that that Lasso Tool selection is just not going to work out. I'm also overshooting their stems a little bit at the base, and the attachment to the trunk is going to be something I'll have to mess with later on in the rendering, so I'm not being too picky about it right now. And once again, I do not have room to be unneat with the stem selection here, because this is how it will join in. I have gills here again, so I need to make sure I have it chosen in a way where with nothing to mask it, it works out okay. I'm just trying to get a more rounded edge to it because the stem is round. I think that's okay. And we can fill it with the dark color first. And that is a very saturated dark color. I don't want such a saturated one, that's better. And then at low opacity. This one is also in the opening phases. It has not opened entirely, but it is opening. It's still growing, and so I'm keeping it slightly more on the brownish side with less white, as that is what seems to be going on with the younger mushrooms. Another reason why it's important to pay attention to the references and to research your subject is the fact that mushroom gills will be at different will appear different depending on which stage of growth they're in, whether they're opened or release spores or no. So depending on whichever position of growth you're choosing, you have to make sure that you draw the gills out in a way that matches. You cannot have fully fledged gills on a mushroom that otherwise looks like it's a newly sprouted one. And gills time. This one has gills too. So we're just gonna select thin disc of the gills. I am overshooting it a little bit on the side where the cap is in front, but not in a very noticeable manner. I'm gonna color pick the dark color I had for the gills here and just make it darker, because this one is even more in the shadow. And make sure my gill layer is beneath the stem layer, and we can fill it. And this is very dark, but I'm not too concerned because I'll be adding in the light section just now. So we've got the lighter ring and then just slightly darker down the middle. And I'm going to choose a much lighter one and add in that opacity of the brush 50% for a seamless blend. There you go. Those gills do not look in a very good condition, but I can work with them in rendering. And then cap time. Once again, I'm not going to bother working around the gills. I will select the entire shape, and I can always just minus the gills later on. Yeah, as for the rest of the shape, I'm going to be meticulous about it, but just not the gills part. I don't need to do the extra work when I can do it in one click. It's work I've already done. Okay, so I'm just gonna Alt click on the gills layer, and that subtracts it. And then I'm just gonna manually bring in the edge that I need. One thing to be careful of with the Lasso Tool is that it will autocomplete edges, so you must be careful about when you let it go. Choosing a good dark color, making sure it's not too green. Okay, and then we can bring in the light edges. Not light edges, the light section. Looks good enough. I think I could bring in some of the darker back in. There you go. Slightly darker because my opacity is low, so the colors do not appear as strong initially. There you go. Okay, and there we have it. Our initial color blocking is all done. I still do not want to close the sketch for very long because it looks ugly, but with the sketch on it looks possible, and we can work on rendering now. We can start on the rendering a little bit, and then I will complete the rest off stream and post it later on. For rendering, we can start. I normally just choose a point to start that works for that particular piece, and I think with these I can start with one of the mushrooms so that I can show the rendering process a little bit. And as for the trees and the trunk, I can complete it either off stream or the next time I stream. Let's put this as group 7. Okay. Okay, let's start. So for rendering, I always add clipping masks for rendering. You could do this on the same layer by alpha locking your initial block-ins and then rendering on the same one. But I much prefer the non-destructiveness of clipping layers. I'm bringing the opacity of the sketch layer down even more. And then looking at references, everything has a pretty pronounced scales. So I'm switching to a plain oil textured brush with no color jitter and with pressure, opacity and flow set to 60%. So selecting a color from the base, I will let's darken it a bit and get the scales initially in, but it's on a more reddish hue. So the scales are concentrated at the top and more loosely. 7 o'clock. So I'm following a reference for these as well. For
Michael is on standby in case anything breaks. The floor is fairly small on insurance. बाकी वो लोग नहीं है इमरान लोग. No, Imran is busy with some family event and William also not around.
Actually, I'm gonna unclip this layer so we can add the fact that the scales sort of curl up away from the edges and are visible like as a bumpy thing above the mushroom cap. This particular species seems to have very pronounced curly caps and they're more pronounced in the earlier phases of growth than even this, whereas some other species tend to have very subtle caps. And these are all those kind of descriptors which you need to make sure you're including in your illustrations if you're opting for scientific accuracy. At this point, I'm getting quite irritated by the sketch, so I'm just turning it off. Rendering is just slowly building up the details. There's no right way to do it or wrong way to do it. You just experiment and find out a good way to render that works for you. I'm starting the scales on this one. Most of the time I start with texture instead, so I don't know why I'm starting with the scales this time, but it seems to work, so it's okay. I'm gonna choose a lighter, more desaturated color and work more on building up the scales, obviously consulting references for how the scales behave. So they seem to have light colors running in between them, but not that pronounced. I think it's more this kind of light color, but just slightly lighter. I'm still on the same layer that is not clipped to the base, and since the scales are curling away from the edges of the mushroom cap, clipping layers cannot work because clipping layers restrict your whatever you're painting on this layer to what is beneath it, and that means that these, if I were to clip this for example, you can watch that the tips of these scales vanish from where they protrude from the mushroom cap. And it's a very subtle detail, but you can see it adds a bit of that more bumpy texture to the mushroom, and you do not want to have that clipped and disappeared from the surface. So this is a more subtle of the scale texture, just in between the pronounced scales there are these lighter sections, and I'm keeping this subtle because they're just meant to be in between the scales. And I'm going to choose a slightly darker color and go over the scales again. Remember, I'm using a brush with opacity is set to pressure and the flow is low, so the color itself is very dark, but when I'm painting I'm not applying such a dark color, so I can push to darker colors on my color wheel, and I know I'm not gonna be painting with 8% dark color. I'm just following the patterns that the reference has for these and building out the scales and all the little details. For now just the scales, but eventually we'll get to the other details. I'm switching to a light color and I'll just brush that in between. I'm gonna push for a slightly more light color, and the point of highest contrast is this region where the lights are brighter than lower and the dark is darker. So I'm just gonna concentrate my light in this area.
I spoke with Telecom. I call on your return, right? So the issue is that if you apply on business, they're taking a 700 rand deposit for the contract before the contract starts, even though it's month to month. They're taking a 700 rand deposit on business. So like I asked them that what is this, that even if it's month to month, why do you take a deposit? But they said that it's policy on business in EU on like planned contract.
Hey, so zooming out, we've got this without the scales and this with the scales. So I'm just switching between a few different references here and building up small individual parts.
Supposed to call you and inform you of all of this, but they haven't. But then personal pay there's no deposit. But then the lady said that she's gonna email us the form, like the application form and everything for the deposit or whatever. I don't know if she sent it to you or not. I spoke to you in the afternoon with them.
नहीं तो पर्सनल कंपनी पे करना बेकार है, फिर पर्सनल पे कर दो. मेरे उस पे कर दो.
Yeah, I'll set tonight.
मेरी पर्सनल पे कर दो, बैंकिंग डिटेल्स बैंक ऑफ कंपनी की दे देंगे ना, हमारा तो नहीं सही है। कहाँ से होता है मुझे बताओ।
The edges seem to have a much lighter fringe, but this one I will clip. So I'm gonna add new layer beneath on the cap, or actually let's leave it unclipped.
I'll just sit tonight and I'll fill it.
And
No, but the application, like on the website, there's like where they ask all the personal details, like for this and this and this, that address.
now I'm just using softly add this fringe along the edges, and this is subtle.
But telecom, but just go to plans. Leave it now, I'll fill it with you.
So I'm just trying to keep the curvature of these strokes and emphasize the fact that it's a round shape that it's coming across. And this white fringe that I'm seeing along the caps in my references is not very defined at all, so I'm just keeping it loose and soft and very faint, so that if I were to zoom out you can barely see it there, but it adds all of these small details build upon each other and give you the final result that you're looking for. So now I'm switching back to the top of the cap, and you can see how much using a brush with color jitter to do the fill-in helps, in the fact that I do not have to manually add all of this texture, I just have to refine it, which saves you a whole lot of work. Now I'm using a small brush. I've zoomed in quite a bit, and I'm just using a small brush to fill in the details of the scales, increase the build upon the darker parts, and add shadows and subtle shadows to the scales, just slowly building up the realism. And personally I'd not shoot for very realistic. My stuff is not hyper realistic. It's mostly stylized, but I'm just looking for that medium of real life accuracy without it being a realistic style. I'm still using a small brush and just filling in these curves of the scales. I'm going to choose a slightly more reddish hue for both the light portions and the dark portions, because I feel like there's a bit of a more reddish tinge to it that my piece is missing. But I don't want to adjust all the colors, I just want to introduce it softly in some places and just build upon it gradually. So you can see there's a good deal of more texture added to the mushroom already. This just needs to be built upon more, emphasize the texture. There's a bit of a more linear texture going on along the sides that is just lines curving around. And for those I can work on a masked layer, a clipping layer, so I do not go past the mushroom cap. And this layer is also underneath the scales I added, so that I do not disturb the work I already did on the scales, so I can build up the texture beneath it. Switching to the monochrome view is a good way to check the contrast. You can see none of my piece has a lot of contrast. It's fairly even dark toned. I'm not concerned about the dark tone as a whole, because that leaves me room for playing with the lighting, but I will try and introduce a little more contrast in the mushroom's cap as a whole. So you can see it's a subtle improvement, but slowly it brings out the textures of the cap. I'm gonna switch back to the layer which has the scales themselves on it and really just push the highlights a little bit. There is not a whole lot of light portions on this, and it can certainly do with some more. I'm trying to be careful to not go over the portions which I've already did with the dark colors, and when I do, then I'm pushing more darks for contrast.
What is? Who's this? It's a new Ford bucket. It's a photo that I got in the email newsletter.
Having the navigator on the side is a good idea to make sure you don't over render the same place without moving on. For now I'm not over rendering, so I'll stick to this guy. I'm using a dark brush now and just building up the scales, making them more pronounced, more clear. I'm just gonna push for a lighter color in between here, where there's higher contrast. Okay, I think we can stand for a little bit color adjustment as a whole. I'm just gonna shift the colors slightly more reddish, but just a little bit. That looks better. And I'm gonna do the same thing to my texture layers, just slightly more reddish. I'm doing this destructively because I mean to continue rendering with these colors, and there you go, that looks better. And I think we will stop here for today, and either I will finish this piece off stream and post it, or if I stream again in the sometime soon, then I can work on it again then.